Presentation on Native American cultural influence on English radicals Thomas Spence and Thomas Paine.
As an avid collector of condors, and I've been that for a while, one of my interests has always been Thomas Spence, and it's been a difficult interest because it's so complicated trying to understand the symbology of his tokens and fortunately for all of us condor collectors and the Condor Club, um, Charles Catlett, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, did an article that is the best thing that he did for all of us because he really answered a lot of questions that a lot of us have been struggling with and stuff. So to me, if you're interested in Spence tokens, that's the first thing to read. It's the January, February issue of TAMS. And I think they have it also on the California Condor Token, the Condor Token Collecting Club website as well. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about Thomas Spence's plan, kind of where it came from and where it went, and how it's related to Thomas Paine. Thomas Spence, born at 2nd July 1750, lived till 1814, was born in Newcastle. His mother made stockings, his father made fishing nets, and they had 19, he had 19 siblings. He was of 19 siblings. So they were poor, and he grew up poor and he died poor. One of the things that Thomas's father did for him was made him read portions of the Bible. Then he would have to explain to his father what the meanings were. And this really helped him in his own education. And certainly when he was doing his research. He was a teacher in Newcastle from 1776 to 1787 before he moved into London. And I've heard a few dates from 1788 to 1791. In Charles's article, he says 1791. In a book on the history of Thomas, it says as early as 1788. So I'm not sure what the date is. There are two big influences that occurred in Newcastle before he did his first writing about his land plan, which I'm going to talk about. One was something called the town moor situation, where there was a large portion of common land that a lot of the common people used to graze on. And there was an effort to enclose it and to privatize it. And it actually occurred, this was in 1771, and there was a big uprising because it affected so much of the population there. And it was reversed 2 years later. So this is one of the big influences that occurred in his life before he wrote his first piece, radical piece. And the other one was he was reading a lot of English Republican James Harrington from the 1700s. And Harrington was writing about corruption, a lot about the value of suffrage, of voting, and how that could help solve a lot of the corruption problems, and as well as not having people in Parliament not being there for long periods of time, switching them out. Let me change slides here. In this book here, Thomas Spence, The Poor Man's Revolutionary, it is not a numismatic book. It is a book that is compiled of a lot of writings about who Thomas Spence was. It does talk about the tokens, and it does talk about how they were used and shows some of them, but it is not a numismatic book. It's more the story of Thomas Spence. It was published in 2014. Now, Thomas, in November 8th of 1775, wrote and delivered a speech to the Newcastle Philosophical Society titled Property in Land everyone's right. Now, this book was, I mean, this speech that he did was later written into a pamphlet called The Rights of Man. But in the speech itself, it talks about the rights of man. And so he was first to really coin that term, even though later Thomas Paine also wrote a pamphlet, The Rights of Man. Now, the original copy of his speech was considered lost to time. But in 2005, a Dr. David Gardner Medwin was going through the records of the Newcastle Philosophical Society and found the speech. And so in this book, it is printed at the beginning of the book, the full speech as is. Even though Thomas Paine rewrote the speech in a way in his pamphlet called The Rights of Man later on. And in some ways, he's well known for that. So what I've done to start with is I pulled out the fourth paragraph of his speech to kind of give you an idea of what he was saying in the speech. And then I'll also kind of give you kind of my opinion based on the other readings as to what the plan was, not in Old English. So what I want to do is just read this to you. It's there. Hence, it is plain that the land or earth in any country or neighborhood, with everything in it or on the same or pertaining thereto, belong at all times to the living inhabitants of said land or neighborhood in an equal manner. For as said before, there is no living but on the land and its production. Consequently, we cannot live without. We have the same property as in our lives. In a native state is property their common. Now, after he passed away, Thomas Malthus wrote this. An idea has lately prevailed among the lower classes in society. This would have been around 1814, 15, 16, that time period, that the land is the people's farm, the rent of which ought to be divided equally among them. This, in a nutshell, is Spence's plan. So basically, Spence wanted to take the land, wanted the land to be taken from the monarch and given to local parishes and rented out to British subjects that were living in each given parish, and that the rents would cover the taxes needed to run the government, and any profits over basic government costs of a given area, of given parish, would then be equally divided amongst the British subjects of the parish. The citizens, including women, although that was mentioned later in his paper, The Rights of Infants, would be able to vote a representative in the parliament to represent them from the parish. So his plan was fairly detailed, but very, very radical. And of course, as soon as he delivered his speech, he was kicked out of the Philosophic Society. And in this book, he is considered an original voice in the history of radicalism. A couple of things. I mean, it tends to sound like socialism or communism, and there's certainly some other things that occur after his death that are quite interesting in that area. But those terms didn't exist at the time. But there was a real religious connection. He wanted the land controlled by the parishes in the country, not the government. So let me move to the next. This is the fourth paragraph in his speech. This is a picture, a modern picture of his Hive of Liberty bookshop in London. This is from 1793. Now, he had two locations. I believe this is the second one. And after the Sedition Act of 1794, where a whole lot of them were arrested, he lost this, and the only thing he did after that is he had his papers in a barrel that he rolled around London and sold. But he never gave up, and his plan never changed. Now, Thomas Paine, a little older, born in 1737, and died in 1809, died a little bit earlier as well. Moved to the colonies in 1774 with the help of his friend Benjamin Franklin. And we all know in 1776, he wrote Common Sense, a 47-page, you see the front page of it there, egging on the revolution. Of course, it was the spark that helped light the revolution. But he also, after Common Sense, from 1776 to 1783, he wrote an additional 16 papers as they were needed to kind of bolster the population, called the American Crisis. Excuse me. Now, these two men had a lot in common. But the first thing is that Thomas Paine was internationally famous. Thomas Spence was not, and never during his lifetime. And Thomas Spence knew this. They both were radicals. Their ideas were radicals. They both were arrested for sedition. Spence was eventually convicted of seditious libel and spent 12 months in prison, but all the others were not convicted. I think Thomas Paine eventually went to France because their writings had quite an influence on the French Revolution as well. They were both anti-monarchist, but more importantly, they both, especially when Paine came back from the colonies, they both were advocates for the poor. They were trying to solve the huge poverty problem that existed in the cities and towns of England and Europe. And so this is what made them so compatible, so to speak. But there was also some big difference. Paine was far more practical in what he was proposing to solve the poverty problem facing so many in England and Europe. He pushed his ideas of raising taxes for pensions for the elderly, annual pensions for the elderly, and startup stipends for young adults to help them get started in life. And he named the prices. He said for startup stipends would be 15 pounds, whereas the annual pensions would be 10 pounds. The stipends would be like a one-time thing. And of course, that's 1,500 pennies. That's quite a bit back then. It's hard for us to think of that being of much value now. Still, Spence would sell Paine's writing along with his own writings. So the thing was with Spence looked at what Paine was saying and said, "You're not going far enough." And that was the real big difference. Paine was just so much more practical. Anyway, Spence sold Paine's writing right along with his and other radicals as well. And I guess you could say he was somewhat, in the book anyway, it says he was somewhat jealous of Paine's international reputation, but he also was respectful of it because he knew Paine could reach a lot more people. Anyway, in the book it says they don't know if they ever met. They were in London at the same time during certain periods of time, but they're not sure if they ever actually met. All right, so here is the only Condor token with Paine's portrait on it. It says Thomas Paine right here. The reverse is Aesop's fable, the mountain and labor, and this is listed as rare. This was Bill McIver's, and he sold it to me a few years before he passed away because he knew how much I was into Spence and Paine. All right. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. It's white metal, rare. The edge is plain. In one of the auction catalogs, it says someone by the name of Mainwaring is the possible maker. This is definitely not a Spence token. Now this is really the subject of my talk. This is Middlesex 823. You have it's the end of oppression, two men dancing. On the reverse, though, it's an Indian, and it says, if rents I once consent to pay, my liberty is passed away. It's copper scarce and has a plain edge. So this is really what I'm most interested in, because the Indian aspect of it means a lot more than just this coin or his plan. It goes back to how the indigenous people of North America influenced both Paine and Spence. So I'm going to read a quote. Here it is here. It's from Malcolm Chase, chapter 2 of the book, and page 18. Like Spence, Paine postulated the historical reality of the state of nature, in which the rights of every individual to an equal share of the soil was absolute. Both men believed that such a situation persisted among North America's indigenous people. In such a state, Paine points out, there were none of those spectacles of human misery which poverty and want present to our eyes in all the towns and streets of Europe. Poverty, therefore, is a thing created by that which is called civilized life. It exists not in the natural state. So both of them understood by looking at the Native Americans in North America that they didn't own land. There was no rent. There was no landlordship. They lived communal. Everything was spiritual. The trees, the water, the mountains, the animals. When they killed the animals, they blessed the spirits. And if anyone went hungry, they all went hungry, or vice versa. You know, there weren't classes. There weren't rich and poor amongst them in the same sense that Europeans. And in essence, they were not the heathens. And that's my opinion. Okay. But certainly it was Spence and Paine's. This was an example of living where everyone has a equal share of the land and the fruits of the land, the hunting, the farming, the fishing, anything that comes, the shelter or whatnot. Now, when let me change this. This is Spence's first token, DH 676. It actually has Thomas Spence's land plan on it. and the other tokens don't. They have implications and things like that, but they don't actually have the wording. All right, this is what it says. The obverse says Spence's glorious plan is parochial partnership in land without private landlordship. The reverse, this plan will produce everlasting peace, happiness, or in fact, the millennium. So he's saying when everybody shares, there's plenty for everyone. And this is his first token. It's actually not listed as rare, but this took me a long time to find. I eventually found it on eBay. But I looked for this for a long time because I felt it was his first statement, his first numismatic statement. Now, when Spence arrived in London, and we'll say definitely by 1891, in January of 1791, sorry, in January 1792, there's a group that was started called London's Corresponding Society, and he got deeply involved with them. This group was started by Thomas Hardy and a group of working men that are already meeting to discuss the affairs of the day. The LCS organized around the Duke of Richmond's plan for annual parliaments and manhood suffrage, and influenced by Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man. But they were also had other radical interests. Obviously, Spence was involved in getting known, but there were a number of others that were involved as well. And you can see that the Duke of Richmond's plan really has some of the stuff that James Harrington from the 1700s, his writings that Spence was so influenced by, had as well. So another important leader was Maurice Margaret until he was sent to Botany Bay in Australia. Other members and radicals were Daniel Isaac Eaton. He had Politics for the People periodic that he put out, and I'm sure Spence was selling that in his shop as well. There was Robert Thompson. He was the songwriter who later fled to France instead of getting arrested. And a lot of the radicals wrote songs to be sung in the pubs where the poor workers were at, because a lot of times the reading was limited, so they would do songs and poems. Excuse me, John Thewall was a songwriter that took over when Robert Thompson fled to France, and was also a writer and lecturer. Francis Place was the archivist of the London Correspondence Society. And then there was John Richter, John Baxter, John Martin, all members tried for sedition. They weren't convicted, but they lavished in prison. This was 1794, the Sedition Act, and they were held there for long periods of time, including Thomas Paine and Thomas Spence. Thomas Spence would eventually be convicted, wasn't until 1801. He wasn't, all of them were released eventually. All right, excuse me. This is Middlesex DH 681, and it has Spence here, and it says 7 months in prison for high treason. It has James down here under the portrait. That was his die sinker, and a great die sinker. He did all these fabulous jobs for him. And the date 1794 below the bust. On the reverse, 3 citizens, and it says, who know their rights and knowing dare maintain, in 1795. So you actually have 2 dates on this: 1794 when he was in prison, 1795 probably the date of the coin. These are some of my favorites. Now, there were 2 coins with the pig trampling the crown. This is the one, the farthing is the one that you see on the cover of the book. This is the farthing. It is, oh, excuse me. Where am I at here? Sorry. It's 1081. Oh no, I left it off. Oh well. Sorry about that. Anyway, this is the farthing sample, a very good sample of it. This is the halfpenny sample, and this is 842. A pig trampling on the emblems of royalty. Pig's meat, published by T. Spence, London. I believe that's what that saying is, across the top of the pig. And the reverse, it has the Thomas Spence, Thomas More, Thomas Paine, noted advocates for the rights of man. Copper, and this is listed as rare. Another favorite of mine is DH 730A. Sailor being seized by a landsman being seized by a sailor, which was something that happened. And in the back, it says Britain liberty displayed, and it shows a guy with, padlock on his tongue, and he's shackled. Freeborn Englishman, 1796. Rare Edge. This is the one with the rare edge. It has Spence on the edge. This is probably one of my favorites because to Spence, cats were a symbol of freedom. They got to do what they wanted, and British subjects did not. The cat, it says, in society, live free like me, 1795. Under the cat, you see James again. The reverse, a hand holding an open book inscribed pig's meat. If lords of all mankind are, then they ye rents should share. Now this has a very distinct clash die on it. You can see the letterings from the reverse, you can see on the obverse, and then you can also see the outline of the pig's meat book if you look closely. So I've seen a couple of these. Mine's a really good example because you can even read the lettering backwards, but there are some obviously some others that were produced as well. This one is not mine. I wish it was. And this is the one that Charles talked a lot about with the snail and really tracked down the meaning of the snail as, again, the snail is free to put out its, its horns where English subjects were not. And it's sort of kind of a play, just like the cat. And he used, animals as symbols. And this on the obverse is the book selling coin. Says T. Spence, bookseller, dealer in prints and coins, Little Turnstile, Holbob, London. So the picture you saw is this this location here. So now, I want to talk a little bit. This is one of his characters about what British subjects have to do if told to. I want to talk a little bit about what happened after they both Paine and Spence passed away. With Paine, there were the Painites and the movement. They met, and that continued. And with Spence, there was the Spenconian philanthropist that also met in groups, and his works and stuff were continue to be used and circulated until 1817, when anything Spenconian was outlawed. The only political type of movement like that was ever outlawed. It just drove it underground. It didn't get rid of it. Today there's the Spence Trust in Newcastle, and they have his material and library and talk about what he was about. But I want to talk about a group that developed not long after they were gone. Actually, it was in 1839. It's the Chartism movement. It was heavily influenced by Spence's writing and Paine's writing. The guy that became the publisher for the Chartist newspaper, which was the Northern Star, which had a bigger circulation than London Times at the time, was a guy named George Harney. And he learned about Spence and Paine and radicalism from a guy named Henry Hetherington, who published his Poor Man's Guardian weekly paper and was a bookseller of radical material. So while the Spencean movement was outlawed, the Painite Club morphed into something called the London Democratic Association. It became the largest Chartist organization. In 1843, John Harney became editor of the Northern Star Chartist newspaper. In 1847, he invited Frederick Ingalls to contribute, Frederick Ingalls and Karl Marx to speak at Chartist meetings and to contribute articles to the Northern Star newspaper. In 1848, the Communist Manifesto was written. So for me, you kind of you can see the influence, the Native American influence of, the natural state of things that Paine and Spence were talking about, how it kind of flowed all the way through. And certainly Karl Marx and Frederick Engels were influenced, and it talks about it in the book, them being influenced by these early radical writings. And there was a big question in the book that said, well, what would have Spence thought about this? And the answer was he would not have approved, for a couple of reasons. Number one, the Communist Manifesto and what eventually happened, in Russia and other places there was no religion involved, and he was a very religious person. The other thing is, we ended up with Stalin in Russia, Mao in China, Kim in North Korea, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, Castro in Cuba. And he would have looked at this and said, well, this is like the monarch. We got this all-powerful person, a small ruling class, and everybody else are the poor workers. And so the book sort of concluded that, he would have said, well, we're back where we started. This whole thing just cycled. Now, interesting for me is when you look at what Thomas Paine was saying should be done, all that stuff happened. Pensions, welfare, socialized medicine, taking care of, programs to take care of children, and all these things. These are things, because he was more practical, really have taken place in most of the Western world. And, unfortunately, the United States is the only country that doesn't have socialized medicine. Of course, people in the United States talk smack about it, but none of the people in the countries that have it talk smack about it. And certainly, when I was in Russia in 1992, the best thing about Russia was getting the fuck out of there. So, that's my view on the writing of Thomas Spence and Thomas Paine.